to go on field trips. I had the opportunity to go to the Western Agriplex, where there was an Indigenous music festival and arts festival there. And so to see that there were kids present and engaging in that space, hopefully they were able to take some impactful thoughts away from that day, as I did, and hopefully that'll be an activity that they'll continue to do in upcoming years. So I'll leave it at that, and welcome Dr. Rob Savage today to our Rise series. You will have read all of the accolades in the brochure that circulated around, so I won't repeat those, but I will share that Dr. Savage is the Dean and Professor at York University, and that I've been familiar with his work for a good 15 years now, since he was at McGill University, and he was doing some work there with a good friend of mine who was a postdoc at the time. So I've been following his career for a bit, and very much enjoying the work that he's done and the work that he'll be presenting with you today. One aspect of work that I particularly enjoy that I've often used in my classes with my students to really talk about literacy development and thinking about literacy is work that he's done looking at how technology can be used in the classroom, and particularly focusing on the interaction between teachers and that technology, and how can that be used effectively to support students' literacy. So I think that's enough for me, and I'm really looking forward to Rob's talk and to what he has to share with us today. So I will let him introduce his talk and enjoy with all of you. Thanks.
Thank you. So thank you very much. I presume everybody can hear me first in the room, yes, and hopefully online if there's a way of noting that. There's some noise going in the background. Great. Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you for the warm introduction. Deanna, yes, we have known each other for a while, haven't we? Yes, but all the stories about Deanna, we'll talk about that later. I'm aware that we have a number of folk from different professions in the room, different backgrounds in the room, teachers. So group of teachers. So welcome. And then we have a group of people, other people from the university, I'm presuming. And as I understand it, Rise brings you together to explore learning, which I think sounds absolutely fantastic, because that's where I spend a lot of my time, at the interface between the work of universities and the work of schools and classrooms. And if you want to hear about the technology stuff, I actually don't have that in this talk, but we can have a conversation about it at another point. But we have created a technology that works, that we give away to schools for free, called Abracadabra. But this is other things that I wanted to spend some time on today. So I'm going to try and present the talk as sort of to try and meet the slightly different needs of the two different parts of the audience today. So I've got a sort of theory, and I've got a thesis, and I've got this some scholarly stuff, but I've also got some applied messages that I think we can reasonably draw with cautions, because we always have to be careful. But we can reasonably make some comments about how these things can be applied more generally out of practice. So I should acknowledge all the funders who put money into this stuff over the past 10 years or so. Let's move on. This is our York University Faculty of Education over there. If any of you know York, I know John does. Maybe a few other things. Unlike today, over here is a beautiful blue sky and picture, as it always. So, I shall move on. I will move on. My slide worker is working, which is something doesn't seem to be doing for some reason. I give this another way that I can advance my slides. Seems to be having a bit of a technical glitch. It didn't work.
Oh. Oh,
Sorry.
just
Yeah,
left.
all right.
Well, the other thing is. Yes.
Oh, okay, well, we'll do that for the moment.
Sorry.
Sorry about. Right, okay, no worries. Okay, sorry about that, colleagues. Minor glitch, which we have now worked around. So, some things to think about today. I think I've come with the theory, come with an idea here that I think we know a reasonable amount from intervention research. People have been doing this kind of work some years, and there's a cumulative body of knowledge that we can draw upon about intervening, as we might talk about it in universities, and what teachers might know as is teaching, i.e. helping to support learning out in schools for struggling word readers. What perhaps has been less common here has been to think about theories about what's going on. Because it is in and of itself a good thing to improve reading, that's often been enough. People say, well, we'll just see what works. Let's just go out there and do the things that we think work and find out what works. But actually, there's a role for theory. There's a role for theory in building the quality and success of our interventions. And I'm going to argue that we'll go further, we'll understand more, and it'll help us both in terms of understanding the science of the reading, but also actually, I think, in helping us understand what's going on in the classrooms and doing a better job, or making it even better and improving it if we do those things. So, I'm going to suggest that there's some theory-driven insights that we can draw upon in thinking about reading and meaning and strategy that together inform how we might think about the word reading part of reading. I want to make sure that people don't misinterpret my focus on word reading as somehow suggesting that's the only game in town. Obviously, it isn't. But it's the piece that I've spent some time thinking about that I'll present to you today. And we know that there are many children, young people out there who struggle with that particular space. So I'm going to tell you about 10 studies. So hope you've got your seatbelts on, because we're going to cover some ground. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that to illustrate some of these effects of theory-driven interventions and how they've helped us and how they've helped us to develop appropriate evidence models. Context of diverse classrooms and diverse needs. So, starting points. We've known for quite a long time, as you can see from some of these elderly references that I've deliberately used, we've known for some time about the importance of phonology in reading in English and indeed in alphabetic spelling systems generally. Speech sounds, the understanding and awareness of speech sounds underpin phonic programs. So the ability to blend at to make cat is apparently a trivial task, but so seems to be so difficult for some children. It assumes underlying phonemic ability, phoneme identification, deletion, segmenting, or blending. And we know from research, right the way back in the 80s and even before, arguably, that it's this unique contribution of phonology alongside what we know about the important role of print sound connection that together underpin this ability of young people to be able to take up phonics and pick it up and use it as a learning strategy. And it's both. Both of those things are strong causal forces. So Stuart Coulthard followed a group of young children very, very consistently, assessing them every 2 or 3 weeks over the kindergarten and grade 1 phases. And it was exactly at that point when children first started developing an awareness of individual phonemes over time, and exactly at that point, and exactly when they had some grapheme phoneme correspondence knowledge, it was just then that the light bulb went off and they started to be able to decode and to sound it. So to demonstrate that, it's just one study. Brian Byrne carried out some very elegant studies, experimental studies. In his book, The Alphabetic Principle, around 2000, describes these. And we know from studies where we attempted to teach young children to read, that phonology ends up being this really important part of it. So phoneme ability mediates the impacts of interventions that use phonics systematically, i.e. it explains the pattern, completely explain who responds and how strongly they respond to an intervention. Full and strong mediation by phonology and letter sound knowledge. And we also know that there is a robust effect of teaching phonics in and of itself. Now that's still been, I say that with some caution, but I know because there are still people out there who will argue otherwise. But I'm going to say to you that there's pretty strong evidence about the impact of phonics teaching on young children in terms of supporting their literacy. I'm also going to say, though, that that effect is modest in size, but it's consistent and statistically reliable. And there have now been something like 14 meta-analyses that we were able to find in our study in 2021 with a range of different learners, typical readers, struggling readers, students with English as an additional language, and others, all of them showing us a robust effect of phonics teaching. It's one part of this. But we're thinking a bit, so you've got all of these sorts of things that you can put in there. But you've got these dual foundations. So there's decoding, our ability to carry out this independent ability, sound out words and work out what they are. Phonic decoding, built on phonology and grapheme phoneme correspondence. So that's a starting point. We've known this for some time. That's not terribly new, but it's a foundational piece. So, okay, some practical questions then. How many grapheme phonemes should we teach? Perhaps the teachers in the room might want to say, well, which ones and how many and how much work do we need to do here? So we took a look at the grapheme phoneme correspondences. These are the ones in Jolly Phonics. Pretty good. The Jolly Phonics is a pretty sensible program. It works quite well. There's some evidence that it works. These are the grapheme phoneme correspondences that you might come across there. I think there's about 30, 35, 36 or something like that in their first versions of this program. So is that enough? Are those the right ones to teach? Well, if you took those Jolly Phonics grapheme phoneme correspondences and you're a really good learner and you had learned all of those grapheme phoneme correspondences, right? Which is not all children, is it? It's some of them, but this is a good reader who learned their grapheme phoneme correspondences, paid attention, memorized them, remembered them, and used them. This is what first page, where the world things are, looks like. Where the asterisks are the unknown grapheme phoneme, not otherwise covered. So if you're only teaching 30 or 40 of the most common grapheme phoneme correspondences, you're not getting to a point where you can be a reader. I'll ask you to assume that this first page is where the world things are representative of a whole spelling system of phonics. I'm sure, but it's going to be something like that. Okay. So we probably need quite a lot of grapheme phoneme correspondence knowledge. But how much? How many should we teach? It's a practical question. Well, the simplistic principle, the first theory that we introduced says that there's optimal instruction. There's a point, there's a sweet spot between not teaching enough grapheme phoneme correspondences and teaching too many. By the way, it has been estimated that it might be something like 461 grapheme phoneme correspondences if you really wanted to map out the entire spelling system for all possibilities. So good luck of teaching that in great classrooms. So what do we do? So theory might help us here. So one way you can look at this and test this is by analysing databases. So instead of showing you just the first page of where the wild things are, we can analyse children's books. This is called corpus analysis. And you basically take all the words from books and you sort of shape them out into a database and you analyse them. It's actually very helpful. It's quite interesting to students. And if you analyse a very large number of children's books, you find, perhaps this isn't very surprising to researchers, but it might be news, the 100 most frequent words explain about 50% of the total. So there's a small number of words that explain a very large amount of the print that children see but adults see. But then as soon as you get beyond that, the next, after that first 100, the next 50, there's a dramatic drop in how explanatory they are, how many words, how much of the text it will help you read. If we turn to grapheme phoneme correspondences, 64 of the most frequent grapheme phoneme correspondences out of that 461 you could choose allow you to read 60% of the word content. So an early idea is 100 sight words, 64 graphemes, and you're home. If you've got that, you've got a system for reading books, would be one. And that's the system Jonathan Solsey and other people put together decades or so ago. And they did some sort of computational analysis. My colleague Janet Bounston presented this data back in 2008. And so she looked at grapheme phoneme correspondences. So this is the bottom line here. And then the percentage of text that could be read. And this isn't the percentage of text in one book, it's the percentage of text in a corpus. So all the books in the children's library analysed out. What percentage of the text could be read? So what you can see here is, of course, if you know no grapheme phoneme correspondence at all, it's a pretty tough thing to read a book. And escalates pretty quickly. 20 or 30 is not enough. But when you go up to this sort of 60 to 70 mark, something interesting also happens. It starts plateauing. You get this asymptotic function. That's a statistician would call it. It flattens out, or diminishing returns. Diminishing returns. So if you teach the first 64, great. But if you times 65, 66, 67 to 100, that doesn't help children read much more. So the payback for that painful paired associate learning that you have to go through probably isn't there. That's interesting, isn't it? That's optimality in terms of thinking about teaching time. That's theory taking us into that space. So that's my first bit of evidence that theory is useful. Here's the Bounston and Solity ones, and you can see there's some unusual ones in there, things that don't necessarily get attention. The GG, for example, or the KN, those come up quite a lot, so that's used routinely. So, analysing corpuses and thinking about the data is something very important. And I used to struggle sometimes. Teachers would not necessarily always understand this model, this statistical kind of model of analysing text. But of course, now we live in a ChatGPT world, and it analyses the statistical. That's what it does. It picks up on patterns. That's what makes it such a powerful reader, right? Because it analyses the statistical patterns and then replicates them and borrows them. It's very good at picking up the connections between print and sound in large amounts of print. But that's what human brains are like as well. Children can do that, and they do pick up those patterns, but they need help in us presenting the most efficient patterns for their brains to be able to take forward and to use them. So we did a little reanalysis. We analysed 500 books. Apparently, the Toronto District Library System is the biggest connected library system on the planet. Yes, exactly. And we did this back in summer of 2014, and we analysed the books that got taken out. You can get access to the data. Which books are being taken out by parents on a Saturday morning for the children? So you can analyse the books, see which are the most popular books. We analysed those. We synthesised them down. What we did for the first time is, instead of running statistical kind of simulations, we went and ran interventions. And this was a small study initially, one PhD student, and we randomly allocated 38 grade 2 students, struggling readers, to a supplemental program. And we had a treatment, an intervention condition, and a control condition who were taught in a different way. And we taught the grapheme phoneme correspondences to these grade 2 children who still didn't know their GPCs. You see they're at-risk readers. And we used the simplicity principle. We went in list order of the most frequent to the least frequent in terms of our teaching program. The other program taught word usage, and later on in another version, letter names, which are not as tightly tied to sounds, are they? So The children who had these simplistic grapheme phoneme correspondences showed large effect sizes, which the researchers thought make sense, value added. The teachers, that means they show big improvements. Large effect sizes, big improvements. So an effect size of 1.8 is huge. Effect size of 1.79 is very good, as researchers would see it. So these are big effects, big changes. I've highlighted one here that just really I like a lot. It's the impact of this one. We measured reading motivation. And the children who learned those GPCs said that they found they were more motivated to read at the end than the comparison group did. So they knew more GPCs and were more motivated. But they were motivated in a very interesting way. They were motivated because they said they thought that the reading was simpler. It's like they'd unlocked, the puzzle. It's not that they somehow loved reading and magically, unfortunately, hadn't unlocked that yet, but they did. But it meant that they had some sense that they could do this. They felt in control. They made some sense of the system, and it worked through. So that's pretty good. We'll take that small effect, but it was significant in these measures. So it can cascade. We need to be cautious about little studies. Small studies don't replicate sometimes. So we do need to replicate some, i.e. we need to do them again, show that the effect is reliable. It's a big problem in science and behavioural sciences in particular, that we can find effects that are terribly exciting, people jump up and down, and then somebody tries to replicate. They can't fly. It doesn't work. So if we're going to give this out, give this away, we need to know that it's replicated. So we took this out in a bigger study across Canada. We ran it in east and west of Canada, and we had 102 provinces, 150 struggling readers, not 38 anymore, and we had them in 50 classrooms looking at their impacts. So we compared these two groups. We had to be careful to make sure the two groups were comparable on other things. We didn't want to be inadvertently measuring background differences or teaching quality or language background or anything like that. So we carefully randomized and checked that the randomization worked on all these features. And this is what we got by way of results. An interesting interaction. And so what you find here, the blue group or the control group, they're doing quite well. They're learning letter names, in this case, and word usage. Those are useful things. So they're doing well. And this is all of their post-tests, so kind of controlled for their performance pre-test. But what you can see is the performance is impacted by phonological awareness. Both interventions. So the stronger you were in terms of your initial phonological awareness, the greater progress you made when you start engaging with the print, however it was exposed. But the most effective and the fastest learners amongst this at-risk group were children who had those grapheme phoneme correspondences in the simplicity order from most frequent to least frequent, and who had stronger phonological awareness at the start of the intervention. So phonological awareness I started thinking about it as if it was a sort of glue, right? Or Velcro or something. Things stick for learning, because all the students got the same learning, they were all exposed to the graphemes. But some children didn't remember them, and it didn't impact their reading as much. So phonological awareness is a kind of glue or Velcro that makes grapheme phoneme knowledge and print knowledge stick in memory. It's kind of how I think about it. So lots of interactions. We found actually that's word reading I showed you, but it also improved their sentence reading. So it's not just individual answers to words and their spelling. And I think it fits this argument about grapheme phoneme correspondences and phoneme awareness together contributing to developing this reading ability. So in our third study, we took this out when I ran with my colleague in Hong Kong, second language learners of English, and they've got Cantonese, entirely different system, character-based system, no letters involved whatsoever. They're really learning a radically different second language. And we found a very similar pattern in those students as well. So, kind of replicated, feeling reasonably confident about those patterns. We're going to move on to the next phase. So far we've talked about phonology and sounds. We've talked about this idea of alphabet. These units help you maximize the power of alphabets, self-teaching. But unfortunately, English isn't really a perfectly realized alphabetic system. There are rules, if you like, you could construe it that way, and exceptions. And this is the classic dual root theory, Max Coltheart's theory. There's one root that we have in our brain for dealing with the words that follow the rules, and we've got another bit in our brain that operates on the words that don't follow the rules. Put it very overly simply, probably. So you've got regular words like dog and supposedly words like trumpet, and I'm not convinced about trumpet. Okay? And then you've got exception words, words that are commonly occurring words where the letter sound correspondences are not primary ones. Okay, so your regularity and irregularity that's the two big games in town under Colthart kind of theory. But English also codes meanings in its spellings. So you get these patterns like nation and national and sign and signal, where spelling represents the shared underlying meaning, even if the pronunciation is shifting. Words like sign and signal. So English kind of tries to do both, and that's probably the problem, but it's trying to represent sounds and meanings simultaneously. So an alternative theory about English is that it's quasi-regular. Okay, well, you've got the quasi, so you've got the idea of it being quasi-regular, you've got this regularity with exception, or maybe more fundamentally different, you've got Richard Benetzi's view that English is morphophonemic. It codes morphology and phonology. Both of those things are in there, and they kind of crash into each other, and they tend to crash into each other in children's studies, in kindergartens, and elementary schools in particular. So it's because they're different. And we know that many children struggle with English, and the most recent data that we have on the table telling us that it's certainly, if anything, we're going backwards in terms of reading standards internationally. It's a big issue here. What about this complexity? Philip Seymour, back in 2003, did a very interesting contrast of European languages. So one end you've got he was working in Scotland and the Scottish children, and he was comparing them reading English against many of the European languages. Many European languages, but not all, are transparent. The letter sound correspondences are very consistent. If you learn Italian or Welsh or German and several other languages, to know the grapheme correspondences is to be able to read and spell. Once you've got them, it's pretty simple. Grammar's another story, but those bits are so simple. You can learn to read Italian accurately in your first semester. And this is really what you're showing. You say you understand work by primary one, grade 1, 90% accuracy across those transparent spelling systems for children. Denmark, which has a messier system, not quite as good. But look at what's happening in Scotland. It's nothing against the Scottish. I say this as an English person. It's the English spelling system. Primary 1, 34% accuracy. Primary 2, 76%. It's tricky. By the time they got to grade 2, they're still not reading at the accuracy level that Italian children are on the first semester of grade 1. So if you're thinking, why on earth this is taking a lot of time, don't blame the teacher the year below you. Blame the spelling system. Because it's hard, it takes more work. So to learn English takes more work. It's going to be more teaching time. Did another analysis. Well, this is I'm presenting analysis of children's books. This is another interesting thing I wanted to draw attention to. Similar idea, another analysis that my colleagues in London, Jackie Moss and my old supervisor, Maureen Stewart, looked at, analysed 12,000 words, nearly 1 million occurrences in 1,000 books. Section, kindergarten to grade 3. Database, 100 most frequent words again explain 50% of the variance. But here's the startling thing. I've always wanted to sort of see, got me thinking back then, still making me think. Over half of all words that occur in children's books, across 1,000 children's books, occur once or twice. Think about that. That's what children are coping with. Half of the words they read hardly ever occur to them. So how are they going to read them? So it clearly, a child who can read, and many do, can't learning those by rote, by sight. They just can't. They've only seen them once or twice, thousands of them. So what's going on? How do these children manage to get these exceptional words into their brains, these irregular words in there? What's the acquisition system for that? Now that's a major piece. They're capable readers routinely in grade 2 or grade 3 by some miraculous process is reading text fluently, correcting themselves, and routinely acquiring low frequency. A wide reading grade 2, grade 3 is acquiring these words, somehow making sense of this. So what kind of thing is going on? So there we go. There's a plot of the frequencies against the rank of the frequencies. This simply shows you there's a very sharp drop off. You've got 100 side words and then it plateaus. Most words occur hardly in, or half occur hardly. So you can see that. So we're going to be thinking about this in terms of a modified triangle. So we're going to try and learn differently. It's got this decoding, which has phonics and phonology in it underneath it still, but where we have to think about spelling and we have to think about meanings, word meanings. And I got interested in something called set variability. English is messy, as we said, so we need strategy to explain how children acquire this irregular spelling system. Carsten Elbro and Bill Plummer presented some very interesting correlational and longitudinal work back in 2011 and 12. And they had this idea that we have to be strategic in dealing with this variability of sounds. That's not enough to know these iron rules. We expect them to work. Children be flexible. You can see in my hand to flexing or manipulating or adjusting to make sure we can get this system to fit. So the initial idea was about we know a lot about phonic assembly, we know about phonic approaches, but we can't possibly teach all exception words. Maybe what we do is we're trying to match what you might call a spelling pronunciation. You sound out a word or regularize it. And then you try and map that against what you know from other things. That's the flexing that we do. And the first parts have been a focus of a lot of attention, a lot of discussion about phonics. We haven't thought about the second part, about this flexing and this flexibility. So this isn't new. This isn't a brand new idea. Eleanor Gibson mentioned it, and I've actually dug back further into the archives to find that it was Levin and others from 1963 first came across this idea of mentally flexing. So it's not a new idea. Gibson and Levin in 1975 got the understanding that there's variability. Children need to understand that there's variability in our rules. If one pronunciation does not produce another word, doesn't make sense in the child has to try different pronunciation. They need a set or a mental frame that encourages this. Flexible thinking about sounds. So for some people, it's about managing vowels. Because vowels are often a problem in English, because they're pretty inconsistent. Sometimes we call mispronunciation correction. So tasks like Bill Plummer's tasks, I like to go camping with my father. And you encourage children to work out what that might be. Okay. Or hint. Pronounces a bit wrong than mint. Muscle. Right? You've got these words, you've got these semi kind of correct pronunciations. So it could be a strategy. And in its most recent version, colleagues in Florida University have been thinking about this idea that it's a kind of semantic cleanup, cleans up the mess of the messy phonological system you get this semantic information that helps to be clear. And they've actually modeled versions of this in systems that are a bit like a ChatGPT in miniature learning systems, computerized learning systems. So if you're a pictures person, I could probably make more sense by using images. So the expert group, you see the word WASP on the page. As an expert reader, you are effortlessly able to access media. Right? Most of us non-biologists, it's an intrusion on enjoying a screen. We know what's being. If you're a novice, and you don't know this word, you read this in text, you sound it out. Sounding out alphabetic systems, sounding out makes sense, right? It's a way of working out new words. WASP, you say. So the unflexible person is stuck. They might know lots and lots about wasps. They may have that word in their vocabulary, they may have been stung by a wasp, etc., etc. But they're not going to make it. They're not going to make the leap if they're not flexible. But if you have the word in your vocabulary, you can be flexible. You can make that part go across. Well, that's what sounds like that. And possibly even what makes sense in this context. Was breach the gap. Based upon the graphene funding correspondences. I have to emphasize this is not guessing. It's not guessing. Very firmly based upon the decoding. Try to find a pronunciation. It's close. Okay. So, separate variability. Lots. I think I can summarize this by saying there were lots of thoughts about it, but nobody had run any intervention studies, correlations, longitudinal studies. So we ran an intervention. What happens if you teach this to struggling readers? They become better readers. That's what theory suggests. So we ran a rather large and grand study in the first instance. Rather, probably should have done a pilot really before we did. But we did it. We had Rebecca and Alberto had 429 grade 1 students. We found all the struggling readers, the at-risk ones, or with low reading scores, about 200 of them across 50 schools. And we screened those below the 30th percentile of the reading measure. And we taught them a direct mapping, we taught them phonics, because this builds out phonics, not instead of. So we taught them phonics, we taught them to directly map and learn those graphic phonic correspondences in real books. And we taught the secular variability strategy. So this is our triangle model where meanings and phonology come together. And our comparison condition, we have a good control condition, good comparison condition. I call it common or best practices, and it was phonics, sight words. And both of them had shared booking. So that's good. That's what would have been state of the practice, right? Phonics, sight words, shared book reading, it's pretty good. Done well, delivered strongly. Good baseline to measure the value added of our intervention against. So there it is. We taught the principles, we encouraged them to substitute it, we had shared book reading. We had a lot of game-based things. So the young children, we tried playful games. You can do things like Simon Says. Simon Says, touch your nose. Simon Says, touch your shoulder or your knee. So you can play around and you can have fun with the stuff with kids. So we did all of that, we had oral games, and then we had print-based activities. So we gave children a 5-step strategy. I can whiz past this quickly because we've got a more accessible version of that I'll show you in a minute. We made sure to link the learning to authentic real books. So here with the OU, I think we worked on this one. So we had mouse and house there. And we would add in so that children had the opportunity to do shared reading and see how these graphic learnings and this strategy worked in real books. Common best practices. Phonic rules. Didn't give them the strategy for flexibility. Did everything else. Same differentiation, same playfulness and fun. The phonic games, for example. And this is what we found. Here's our results on a standardized reading test. This is Gratch word reading. Blue is before we intervened. Orange is actually where we started our intervention. So the difference between blue and orange was our what I call tier one intervention, work with teachers on good strategies, do professional development. There was a modest improvement in both cases. But what you can see from the silver Manhattan is the impact of our interventions. And you can see there that by the end of grade one, we've got a big effect on those struggling readers. Many of them are pushing up average readings, word reading at least. And interestingly, we're able to find an effect that was still there at the beginning of grade two. Come back after the summer, haven't run the intervention at all, obviously. Learning fades a bit, doesn't it? But we still found an impact and an advantage for the separate regulated intervention 4 or 5 months after the intervention finished. So we were very happy with that as our evidence base. We don't find the same patterns for pseudo word decoding. That's okay, because we're not expecting separate ability to be very useful with pseudo words, because it's about meanings. Bring in semantic parts. So I think this fits our theory. Specific lexical effect, word effect. We also found the effect, it's modest, but we did find an impact on sentence comprehension as well. Cascades out into sentence comprehension. I can explain why if we have a moment a little bit later. We're also able to show that it transferred into French. So my PhD student had an interesting idea. He said, "Oh, if you're working on this intervention program entirely in English, what about what happens in French? French is a somewhat opaque language for spelling. It's not quite as bad as English, arguably. Some would say it's, in some senses, it's more complex, but it's certainly not transparent. Does it work? Well, yes, it does. We've got transfer effects into French, even though none of the content referred to French whatsoever. In the same children, and small and medium-sized effects, and the largest effect being regular or exception words in French. And what this also, I think, indicates is that it must be processed. It can't be about learning specific graphic correspondences, because none of the specific graphic correspondences in the reading tests were shared across English and French. So it has to be something at a slightly higher level, something about understanding of the process of being flexible. We are. How much of the time? I hope we're not dragging on too long, but I've got a few more to show you. I could go through them relatively quickly, but here's one I want to say a little bit about. We attempted, I went back to the UK back in 2017, and we had the opportunity to run a very large scale study because there's a culture there of running these randomized trials to assess interventions, then potentially impact policy. The Education and Adaptive Foundation commissions and runs these large scale studies. So this big randomized controlled trial, and it had lots of formal characteristics that were very strong, including external evaluation. It had all these really good things, and 123 schools, 4,000 children studied. We pre-tested in the autumn of 2020. And then, unfortunately, some bad things were happening. There was a pandemic you might have heard of, swarming into town, and we had to do Zoom-based work, and we tried to make it fit. But I was always confident in the leaders who would take us through the pandemic, and sure enough, those great leaders stepped away from the parties that they were having to steer the country through this troubling time, and we were able to run our interventions. Unfortunately, we were never able to get into a school, and it was a very, very messy time. So we could do no evaluation of how well the intervention was delivered, whether teachers were doing it. We had no idea, and they were incredibly busy and incredibly stressed. We actually started the intervention when everybody was at home, trying to do it at home with parents and things. So take it with a pinch of salt. We really don't know what was happening in this space, but I was determined that we try and do everything we could to help schools to children this time, anticipating there would be any learning loss. So here's the 5 elements of our flexible phonics programs, as we called it: graphing, phonemes, and direct mapping. I didn't have to include phonics here because phonics is very firmly embedded in the English in the English curriculum. So that was already being done. So it assumes phonics takes place. So there's more graphing, oral vocabulary, teaching vocabulary words, this mispronunciation correction set variability strategy. And we also included an additional kind of version of this for very struggling readers, which I can tell you about afterwards if you like. I won't delay here, but we had an element to it that we had some extra strategies for the really lowest performing readers. We had bookmarks like this with the strategy steps. We tried to build a community of practice, but there was a pandemic. We did our best. We had these Zoom meetings and online. We had a manual. Each of the schools in this study got £500 worth of quality children's books to help implement the intervention. Connected to our piece. And we did the best we could. Now, our results at this point show no reliable overall main effects of the intervention for these young children who are kindergarten age. There was a marginal effect, though, which I think is what it's suggested when it's combined with a vocabulary intervention. It's a program called NELLY in England, which is a very powerful and evidenced early phonological vocabulary intervention. So when we had NELLY and our intervention together, we started getting effects in the. I think that's a clue about the importance of vocabulary language. We did get there's a trend in the data that the strategy works better for exception words than for regular words, which is what you expect. But it is tricky to make sense of because of the context of question, and there were significant learning losses, and many of the children actually didn't have foundation phonics because they missed that foundation phonics class. Really got in the way of the it's a null finding, but it's a cautious one, and it's a complicated one. And indeed, it was so complicated, I decided to write a book about it. So I think it's always important to not succumb to the file draw problem and hide away all the findings that are inconvenient. Rather, we've got 200-page books coming out in March 2025. It talks all about this. And the idea of the book is to tell the story of the trial, but also about randomized trials more generally. And the book is a bit like one of those, those making of such and such a movie. You go behind the scenes and see how they made the movie. The idea was it's a bit like the making of Star Wars or something. You go behind the scenes and you see how a randomized trial was run. So that's there. It also has some important pieces in there, I think, about how governments can get in the way of supposed evidence-based practice and some other complications that bear a good read. It's completely free if you download it. There's nothing for sale here. I have no commission, so I'm not on the sale here. But you can order it through your university library and pay for, or you can download it. Last 2 or 3 studies, I'll just tell you a little bit about at this point. We've talked about struggling readers and we've intervened. I think most often we've been effective in intervening and adding value, preventing reading problems by doing work with phonics, vocabulary and strategy together. What do you do if children don't respond? What happens then? What if they haven't responded to that? This hard to remediate group. Is it more of the same, or do we need to do something different? So we were playing around with this. We had in a small study, we looked at our simplicity idea of phonic blending at tier 3, the 3rd phase, and then we contrasted it with structured word inquiries. A little bit different. Structured word inquiry is Pete Bowers and others. You might have come across it. Some of you might have heard about this. It builds upon this idea about the power and importance of morphology, especially. So these connections that we've already talked about, such as those between sign and symbol that we mentioned earlier. So if English is morphophonemic, maybe we should teach the morphemes if the phonemic stuff hasn't worked. Structured word inquiry focuses on morphological frames. It focuses on roots and the morphemes, of course, and building patterns. It has a heavy emphasis on etymology, the history of words, digging around, finding the historical connections that join words together in English. It uses word sums, which are these sort of sort of quasi-mathematical ways of breaking words down into their morphemic units, like make and ing, making, hoping, hopping, etc., react, and it sort of really spells out the morphological shapes of those words. That makes those manifest. It uses matrices. So you start with a root or base, and then you build large numbers of families of words around that base. That's the XOC. You can get a large number of words out of some bases. You get 20, 30 words out of a single base. This is the active one. We'll play around with that. It has a heavy focus on inquiry-based learning and discovery in that sense. So we looked at this, we contrasted these two different models, relatively small scale study, but have to be a little bit careful. Three conditions that start with a low intervention control are simplicity and structured word inquiry. 10 times a week, 10 weeks, 3 times a week, in a reasonably well-designed study with all the making sure that we would actually compare the treatment control. Here's our effects for word reading. And you can see here that the structured word inquiry one did seem to do a little bit better than the simplicity. The modest effect, this one was just about significant in our study. It's the modest effect that it's there. I also need to report all the things that aren't on the slide. We had a number of other variables that we analysed, and we couldn't find any effects in any of the evidence. So we've got small effects on word reading and not much else going on. Fairly sustained intervention. I think our results actually are quite like those of a lot of people now. But morphology isn't magic. It doesn't somehow give you the answer. It has some effect, and there are still question marks about how much it generalises, but you can sometimes get some effects if you're working hard. We found the piece in red is to say we found an interaction effect, and essentially the children who started with strong morphology were the children who benefited most from morphology intervention, which is actually the opposite of what somebody would say, but it always seemed to be implausible to me. But it's those who start with the strongest, because if you've got low morphology, it's really going to be hard to benefit from morphology intervention. So it's just not knowledge. This was run by trained university students, so we have no reason yet to know or believe a reason to say that this can work in schools, because it's one thing for the trained students to go out and run, it's the only thing we do versus class of teachers. It's a different question, interpretation. So we have to be a little bit cautious about this, but some interesting things. Another study, we used morphology. This time what we tried to do was to think about different parts of morphology. Morphology is quite complicated in implemented in different ways. So we think this is the first study that used different kinds of morphology. So one approach, some approaches emphasize this oral inquiry, reflecting on the patterns in English, heavy focus on the discussion and exploration. Other approaches are much more focused and print-based and focused on showing that the printed consistency exists between these words, show meanings without the inquiry and without focus on all the oral language. So direct instruction versus inquiry-based learning. So what happens if you do those things? You can set it into theory. This is a rather complicated diagram. Apologies. This is a basic model of the reading system. But don't worry about too much of the detail. You don't need to know everything here. Basically, for the morphology itself, what it shows is there's probably different pathways for the role of morphology. One pathway is this print one, which is about learning about vector and printed meanings, word level. And another part of morphology is its function as a general language resource that's likely to play with vocabulary in influencing comprehension. Right? So morphology sort of sits between the two, depending on who you teach. So according to influential theory, relatively recent theory, the oral morphology part and the focus on that inquiry should impact comprehension, and the focus on that direct instruction in the words should influence the pathway that's about pre-meaning associations. Carl Beck and others, Deacon, Downs. So we've got tools like this with the morphological tasks like this, these are oral tasks. Permit, father refused to give, we have to derive the correct pronunciation. Density, the smoke in the room was very, that's what we did with these children. We picked children who struggled in reading tasks, struggled in morphology tasks. When we selected these children, interestingly, on the basis of poor morphology, we did find actually a pretty typical pseudo word decoding. So one of the things that I would emphasize is that these two things can be somewhat separate as the models might be. And if you are doing with the best will in the world, screening in your schools to identify struggling readers based upon their pseudo word decoding, you're going to mess with these kids. That's quite important to know. Whole cohort, 63 kids there, all of them would be missed. And then you might be surprised to find later that they are more components. But they are. We delivered again small scale university students. So this is the print-based decoding research in summary. Focusing on affixes, irregularities, basically very simple, modest amounts of meaning focused work around the vocabulary. We've got word sorting, word mapping, word building. We didn't discuss counterexamples. The red text, we did a lot of print-based games, lots of over-learning of print meaning patterns. Teacher-led. In the oral analysis, very different summary of analysis here, understanding the meanings, depth of vocabulary learning, very much an oral piece working on depth of vocabulary learning, using images and conversations wherever possible. And we very rarely use text. The teacher was a facilitator guiding these discussions amongst these grade 3 children about language. Emphasis on thinking and exemplification experiences. And we got children playing around with counterexamples, get them thinking. So, for example, does the word uncle have a prefix un? For example, playing around, is that morphing? Getting kids to think about this stuff. So you see what I mean about these sort of more intellectual kinds of stuff, verbal reasoning sorts of things, and gain some fun approach. So what happens? What we found is what the theory predicts, actually. So we get a main effect of the morphological decoding on reading vocabulary. So we measured this by asking children to read words and say what the word means. So word reading, they were much better at this than the other condition. But the children who got the oral size of things for the morphological analysis condition, we didn't get an overall effect. But what we did get is a kind of interaction. The children who had good language skills at the beginning proved more, but that they added greater value as a result of our morphological intervention. So there are some children in the oral language condition better, some didn't. Yeah. So, but both they outperform the control conditions. So that sort of fits the theory a little bit. Early work, small sample, we need to be careful about what we say. So there might be a place for both. They're going to be doing different things. You can do direct instruction and you can do inquiry. They're not opposites, they're actually doing different parts of the same system in this one. Okay, last couple of things. I won't go on to realise I've been at it for a little while now. Just to give you a bit of a flavour for some of the things we're working on right now, studies 9 and 10, we've been looking at tests of these different conceptions. So we've been talking about this idea of quasi-regular versus morphophonemic. Quasi-regular, it's a bunch of rules, exceptions. If you have that, you teach phonics, and they set your variability strategy. Right? Because that helps you. Then you've got both. If you think English is morphophonemic, then you have to teach phonology and morphology. So no one's really looked at that contrast yet. So we set that up, that's our contrast. We've got phonics plus strategy versus phonics morphology, and both of them have shared programming programs. So far, what we found with this in a study, we find significant improvements in both interventions. We've done this with several hundred students in Alberta, 50 schools, 273 students. All of this. They're starting reading with standard scores of 75, low reading, and they're pushing up towards the average range. And interestingly, they're continuing after we finished intervention post-test, even after we finished, optimistically, that curve is still going up.
How long was the delay?
Very good question. It was about 3 months. So small, but they hadn't done anything with us for 3 months. So that we could improve on that, but it's going in the right direction. Very often interventions fail, going the other way. So that's optimistic. We couldn't find much differences between, by the way, differences between the two interventions. I'm wondering at the moment about whether we didn't give it enough time to make the two interventions sufficiently different enough from each other. So the next version of this is we're going to have more difference, if you like. We're going to have a heavier focus, heavier focus on morphology. See what happens. But I've got one other thing I think is quite interesting. Now, take a breath. Don't worry, you don't have to. The complicated, all of the print here is for the researchers. I'm going to give you the headline if they're not of interest. In our study that is now about to come out in Scientific Studies Reading, we tested 10 or 11 theories about what's going on in those interventions. Basically, what we did is we wanted to look at what's predicting what's going on. Is it the set of mobility ability, or is it the morphology that's predicting who improves? That's one set of questions. The other question is when does it have an effect? Most studies currently look at prediction of response to intervention, measure their pre-test before the intervention, and then look to see how they respond post-test. But there's another thing you can look at. You can look at what happens from post-test at the end of the intervention to the next stage, the delayed post-test. And the pre-test post-test stage tells you about what happens when you're directly instructed. What's going on, who responds in your classroom when you're teaching your children. The follow-up bits between the post-test and the delayed post-test tells you what predicts outcomes when children are learning outside of the intervention, in more free-flowing, self-teaching kinds of situations. So there's different questions. And we had questions about what kind of words, the regular words and the exception words, we're expecting different patterns. Those words that break the phonic rules, we're expecting a role meaning to come much more. Does that make sense? 3 sorts of things. And for the researchers, you have to read quickly because that's the 12 we can think about basically. But just to say, you can test 12 theories in an intervention study at once. So let's have a look. These are called panel analysis. Cross-link panel analysis. They're basically correlations. And what we're looking at, don't worry about too much complexity. These are all about controls. So we control for the fact that children are in schools, and children in the same school tend to be more similar than in the next school. What we're looking at is these patterns in here, these lines. Look at the dotted lines and the bold lines, because they're showing us pre-test, post-test, and delayed post-test. And we've got reading and set variability in this one. And what you can see here for these words, for set variability for reading regular words, is that set variability at post-test impacts how many words they read 3 months later and that delayed post-test. That's the only effect that we're getting reliably. However, if we turn to morphology, nothing's coming up. Dotted lines mean nothing significant. So morphology is not driving you. Your variation in your morphology isn't driving your improvement in this reading of these exception words, these regular words. Let's look at those irregular words, the exceptions. These are the words that don't follow the phonic rules, where we might expect set variability to have an effect. And lo and behold, it does. You can see the bold lines and a very, very interesting interactions going on. Set variability at the end of the intervention predicts their reading of these exception words 3 months later. Reading at the end of the intervention predicts set variability. They're kind of interacting together, they're bootstrapping each other. It's not happening during the intervention. It's not while it's being taught that separability matters. It's afterwards when they are reading and involved in other activities. It allows them to accumulate these words for themselves. So I'm going to argue that it's a self-teaching strategy for exception words, just like phonics is a self-teaching strategy for reading words. Debate that, discuss that, but that's the idea that's coming through. And then again, if we look at it for morphology, the dotted line means nothing's going on. Morphology isn't driving. I'm not saying that. So while the two interventions had equivalent overall effects, the engine seems to be separability. It's mental flexibility in adjusting phonics, playing around with it seems to be very important. So however you teach it, that seems to be there. So we have come to the end. 10 studies, multi-year interventions, grade 1 to 3, instructing readers. I'm going to argue that children learn phonic work when they're learning phonology, graphic phonic correspondences, and when we're mapping those out into real books, ideally on the same day. We call that direct mapping. Beyond that, strategies for mental flexibility we can teach. Children seem to pick them up. And then they can apply them. And we have some evidence that this allows them to become independent readers of those exception words, those words that don't follow the patterns. And as we've shown from the corpus analysis, maybe this is the way the children solve that very complicated problem, dealing with low frequency exception words that we do in books. That's what we're reading. Self-teaching mechanism. There is a role for morphology, but we need to be a little bit careful about it. We're finding modest and small and occasional effects. Maybe other and better in different ways, different studies, more work to be done. Overall, English is complicated. The spelling system means there must be several things that we need to do. Phonology is one part, but strategy and vocabulary knowledge are likely to be very important areas, and possibly morphology as well. To be building something in here to help children make sense of complex English studies. In theoretical terms, we think our triangle models can make sense of those. So thank you for listening. I hope that wasn't too long, and I did put that painful last slide of 12 theories on the last slide. Forgive me. I hope you found that useful. Thank you very much for listening. Very happy to take questions. Asking about the technology.
I was curious what happens with second language learners.
Yeah. We haven't looked at it yet, but it's an interesting question. Certainly, we know from some studies that you can teach phonics, and they learn phonics because that's somewhat independent vocabulary. So this is the vocabulary does end up being a very important piece. So it deserves its own focus. We may be able to have a look at this in Toronto in our studies, where the majority of children in the schools are going to be working at have English as a second language, and how do they have other languages going on in spaces. We may be able to look at some aspects of it. And it's a very interesting question how this might play out across other languages.
Because I find personally as a second language learner, I'm constantly code switching. And I would do Canadian until I hear someone else say it differently.
Yes.
And sometimes when I look at class, I have to think what that is. I am translating in masculine in my head.
Right.
Trying to work it out.
I think as adults we do also still do this. We meet words first in print, but we don't think the pronunciations. I can think a few years ago I met the word SEGUE. SEGUE is CU, and then I started hearing people say, well, that's a nice segue into such and such. And at the point where the penny drops, I linked the two up. But I think we do that. We'll regularise the pronunciation that we meet in print. We don't connect it to a meaning. So that happens. And we do also know that if we sound out words that are irregular, then our Erie showed this several years ago. It does actually impact spelling in a positive way. sounding out the letters, even if the word is irregular, has a positive impact on the spelling. There might even be a second language advantage. I'm speculating wildly, I don't have evidence on anything. Well,
I was really struck by that figure about the diminishing returns of GPC rules to what you can actually do. Right? And at some point, you start auditing out the better how much more restriction you get. Then that makes me wonder, well, what are you teaching them? I guess, is it that morphological awareness gives them a different variety of things to discover books and spelling? Or is it that at some point, what you teach them becomes less important and they're just kind of either going to figure it out for themselves or they're not?
well, I mean, if you accept a morphological theory,
Yeah.
what you're connecting is that cluster of letters to a morpheme, to a unit of meaning. Somewhere in our brains, there's a connected pathway that you're gluing together. And then you're using the recognition unit that you're then using when you work. So if you have a word like react, you analyze that as re and act and connect it to the relevant meanings, the print meaning associations, as opposed to sounding it out and getting reeked.
When we talk about decoding, you think that if you recognize act, you don't recognize act as a holistic unit, you think about it as an assembly of letters that you're associated with individual phonemes. So this pivots away from that and suggests that it's much less granular. Is that the idea?
I think
That
the
also means that what you know about act doesn't generalize to, say, some other word that looks like act, but doesn't have quite the same order of letters, right?
I think the advocates of this view would say, what would they say? They emphasize the letter, the role of the letters is still there, letter names, some flexibility in the letters may be there. But I think their accounts are underspecified and don't really fit with what we know. You know, a great deal of what we know from the basic experimental science about what recognition was reading. But I guess they would need to argue, as I said, that they set up these recognition units that would be a granularity of that kind. I personally find that implausible, and I don't think it fits with a very, very large amount of experimental adult data. But those are the games in town that people are advocating for in spaces. They could be better specified. There are accounts there are implemented accounts that use morphology. People have used them in connections modeling. There is some connections modeling with morphological approaches. You might fill in the apologies for Laura Goneman and other people have done that work quite a long time ago. So those are there. You're not doing something that might be quite.
I may agree with you.
So
But I mean, it's an interesting question, right? How would this?
I mean, the whole thing hinges upon ultimately on whether these are generalizable units. You know, phoneme is a useful thing to know about because it allows you to do some generalization. A grapheme is useful. Exception word isn't. Is a morpheme. Does this generalize? This is going to be the key question. We are not finding fantastic evidence of generalization. I think, at this stage.
What do you think about the YouFly program from the viewpoint of the simplicity principle?
I've not analysed the background of that, because I had looked at it. I think YouFly is a little bit, to my mind, like it's one of those things I started at the beginning that it's very important that we teach children to read. And let's sort of put some stuff together that we think is going to work. It seems okay. But it's not fantastically theorized, I think, and it's not really been evaluated. It's not much evidence of that YouFly as a program works. It's based on things that we assume that we know do work in broad sense, but it's not really been evaluated. It's problematic in one of it's gone big without an evidence-based directive for it. So is it optimal? I don't know.
I know SIG teaches, I think, 120 grapheme phoneme correspondences.
Yeah.
Which seems to be more than Solid and Gooseman would suggest.
Yes, it does seem like that. And we could actually, you could probably, thank you for that link, right? You could probably do some modelling with the U5 GPCs and actually confirm that against the piece. I don't know that we want to inflict it on children necessarily as a study, but you can do some computation. Yeah. Mind you, my sense is that it's starting to plateau out. 64 is quite a lot. And you know, it does what the piece about how frequently words occur, that evidence is unarguable, but it drops off the cliff very, very quickly. And you start getting extraordinarily, if you look up, there's a piece from Tia colleagues who map out these 461 graphics. You know, you've got a dozen possible pronunciations for the letter A, such as the stomach thing. You know, it's not going to be useful to learn all of them for sure. I suspect learning 120 is probably better. If they evaluated the program, then we would have. Yes. Yes.
I really was interested in when you were talking about phonic mapping and the use of authentic texts. It sounded like a lot of full class experiences. And even just noticing from the example there, it didn't seem like a very decodable text, which is what we see a lot of now in different programs and phonics teaching. And so I wanted to hear more about, you know, it wasn't entirely decodable based on the GPCs they've had. So is it more full class experiences where the teacher would be pausing and guiding the decoding of the GPCs the students have learned?
Yeah, so this is a really, I think it's quite interesting. So thank you for the question. This is something teachers, Brian, you want to know about. Very often people have been told that we have to use decodable text. Many government guidance documents, it sits there. You know, there isn't actually evidence that that's required. Not any actual evidence that decodable text is somehow better than non-decodable text. In fact, some of the research suggests that there's no difference. No difference now between decodable text and non-decodable text in terms of reading and phonic outcomes. There's a few years ago, so I think it's pretty mixed. So I worry about this. One of my concerns is sometimes when you get evidence-based practice, these other things creep in that aren't parts of evidence-based practice. You know, it's a bit like, you know, because why you see something like phonics becomes skill and drill and homework sheets. There's no evidence that that's actually required. And I worry that this thing about decodable text is one of them. Clearly, if children are reading words on their own, and they only have phonics, not the flexibility yet, they're not going to get very far with the text. It's not going to be okay. So that's yes, you want to expose children to decodable text. On the other hand, if they have got some flexibility, many children seem to. If you don't expose them to more complex texts, you're depriving them of the opportunity to acquire them. They're learning. If they have the capacity to benefit from the experience independently, then you want to. So you need to be, as a teacher, you have to work out, hey, are they one of those, the ones you need to be keeping an eye on down here, or are they one of your take-off people in your class who's starting to acquire words independently? If so, you don't want to get in the way of that. You definitely don't want to get in the way of that. So I think that's what I would go with there. The other thing is that the quality of decodable text versus authentic translation. The richness of the vocabulary, the richness of the sentence structures, the diversity of those books in other important ways are so far in ahead of the most of the decodable texts. I would worry about diet. But you know, you can analyze decodable text and look at the vocabulary, and it's just nothing compared to the simplest, even preschool read of some of the quality texts that we make. We live in an age when past 15 years or so, 20 years maybe, or more, there's an explosion of quality tutors, which there are so many interesting books out there. Beautifully written books. So I would be wanting, if I was the teacher in the class, I'd be trying to keep a bit of that. And the other side of it is you can find some books have quite a lot of a lot of high frequency words. So if you are doing want to work around high frequency words, you know, that's going to be consistent in some of those books. and children are easy. So that's why I say I'll emphasise we don't have sharp evidence. But I think it's, on the other hand, that absence of evidence suggests it's not such a big deal. Those who want to say you need decodable text need to actively prove that decodable text are actually multiple their strong price.
Perfect, David. I appreciate your lecture on your study and research, and the grapheme and volume mapping idea actually reminded me of my observation with my daughter's reading, because when I have read Chinese, actually I'm from China, and when I have read a story to her for many times, and then she almost could remember that. Memorize word by word. And when about 3 or 4 year old, she started to turn pages, and actually from the sounds that had already impressed her, she could just recognize the characters. So I wonder, even for Chinese, there's a kind of grapheme or graphic and sound mapping, whether she could do even more successfully as he starts learning English. Because English seems to be to show much more of this mapping phenomenon.
So thank you for the question. So I'm not a Chinese speaker, so
Actually, I have another
Oh,
question.
okay.
And the latter one seems to rouse more of my curiosity. That is, so this is preschooler. I just read some stories to her. I could see a lot of self-teaching, and you just put some stress on it. I wonder, as teachers, how could teachers facilitate the students' self-teaching ability? Of course, teachers would like students to learn from us, to get more benefit in classrooms. But basically, if teaching instruction can be given to all class, but still different individuals would just arrive in different stages. That's just because of their self-teaching abilities. So I wonder your insights on that.
yes. So okay, great. So the first part about turning the page and mapping out, there is a bit where children can look as if they're reading because they've read that story with you so many times. You've obviously done all the right things as a parent, regularly doing Shepherd reading because you have a track also next. There's in alphabetic systems, English is but that grapheme volume, that phonology, that phonemic level is very important. In character-based systems, phonology still has a role, but it may be as reading matures, it's less important than the other things. Morphology ends up being very important. Chinese, there's a fluency in rapid naming often associated with it. Phonology can play a role. Very often it's about onsets, those initial sounds can play a role. Rhymes have some role in Chinese, but you've also obviously got intonation as well. That's a whole other space. So phonology can be important, and there's a phonetic radical which gives you some clue in some context to the pronunciation of words. So phonology can be a part of it. So your daughter's doing well to find phonological patterns in.
Yeah, because I was a little amazed.
Yeah. Well, she's doing well to find phonological patterns in Mandarin or Cantonese, Mandarin. So she's doing well. It is a force, and in some jurisdictions, children learn. As I'm sure you know, they learn pinyin or alphabetic simplified alphabetic basis before they get exposed to characters. In some jurisdictions, but not all. And so they are clued to print sound relationships with that pinyin. I don't know if you did any pinyin with her, but she's doing well to do those.
No,
okay,
okay.
Very talented. She's doing well to find those backends. So I think you can encourage her with that. And certainly that ability to find those mappings is very helpful. What really served her well in English. She'll probably have to do other things in which I'm used to being forward in that space. In terms of the self-teaching, there was a question around differentiation. The teachers out here will know that there are some children who need the direct teacher-led focus. If you're a grade 1 teacher, particular, possibly in other years, there are some children in your class typically who just need that focus and you need to be there with them, making sure they're working independently. They're not independent. But then there are children who are ready to take off and can move towards that are using self-teaching, who are reading to learn, the old cliche things. And we have some data on that. Carol Connor sadly passed away just a few years ago. Did some really nice work evidencing this by looking at individual variation in what is effective teaching practice. There isn't one size fits all, as everybody knows. We should be able to show that. There are some children who really benefit from that teacher-led, teacher-directed focus, the ones who are still working from the foundations. And it's actively not a good idea for teachers to be directing the students who are interested, who can sound out words themselves reliably, who can read those words, who then remember those words the next day when they read them. That's an interesting test. If they can do that, really, then maybe they can be. You can take off the book and give them a task and tell them to come back and ask you what the book's about. And other things. Carol Connor showed some of this work in that work around differentiation. That's very powerful. In saying that there are different things. And actually, there isn't one size fits all. It's a talent differentiation. So you have to know where your children are, you have to understand reading, how reading works, you have to know where your children are, you need to be able to assess progress and adjust accordingly. That would be some of the features that you emphasize about really strong teaching. Great one.
Teacher's direction could be a kind of trigger in most of this.
Yes, and so hopefully the ones who are still working towards will get there, and there's also going to be someone moving up, graduating up to that group or independent over the course of the year. If you're lucky, you'll have some in your class who start day one. Other children may take large parts of the year to get to that point. But self-teaching can be assessed. Are they sounding out those words independently when you're not really paying attention to them? Are they then storing those print knowledge? Self-teaching is about storing print-specific information through phonics. And can they then access that information? So if they sound out the word dog and they read it, then they meet it tomorrow, but they just then read it. Those are the signs that should be required.
There are no more questions. Thank you so much, Rob, for not only for your wonderful talk, but also for coming and spending some hours with us. I know you're very busy as in your role as dean. So thanks very much for coming. Thank you all for attending. We do have some feedback forms that if you wouldn't mind completing those. And please also know that on the Center for the Science of Learning website, we do upload the recordings of all of the presentations. So if you have a colleague who wanted to be here tonight but couldn't be here either online, I should also thank everybody who's still online with us for joining. But if you have colleagues who couldn't join today, please direct them to our website. All of the recordings are there. We will have additional RISE events forthcoming, which we're in the process of planning. So please watch this space. I think there was a sign-up sheet for our email list. So if you want to join that email list, we'll keep you posted on our events. But thanks so much for coming, and thank you very much, Rob. We'll do some refreshments there at the end if you want to help yourself, because otherwise they'll end up in the